who has his PhD in reproductive biology over some 16 years or so in research in reproductive biology, and including academic positions and teaching veterinary students. I believe it's in Virginia, in the school in Virginia. It's for about 5 years he's been teaching there. And right now he is with the APA for the last 6, 7 years? 11. So I think is going to give us from all aspects, both regulatory and experimental and mechanistic, and we really look forward to your presentation, Eric.
Thank you, Zadok. Is this working? Oh, that's fine. Can you hear me? Is that at that level? I'd like to express my appreciation to the Davis Foundation, Sandoz, Dr. Rubin, and Dr. Boyce for the opportunity to meet with you, and I really do enjoy that opportunity. I expect I will after I'm done as well. Before I launch into the slides in the more formally prepared presentation, I jotted some notes all morning on just seemingly miscellaneous things or randomly distributed things that came up as Dr. Russell was speaking and as you asked questions. And I think rather than have them left to the end when we're probably going to be running out of time, I'll be tired and be rushing, or I don't want to rush, but might be, that it would be better to just launch into that potpourri now and comment on some of them. Before I do, I need to state that what I'll be saying is as an individual, not necessarily indicating EPA policy. At the same time, I'm the chair of the effort to develop the EPA guidelines for reproductive toxicity risk assessment. I've been very much involved in the redoing of the testing guidelines for the multi-generation reproduction test, and in general have a task at EPA to have leadership in really developing the area of reproductive risk assessment. So having said that, I'll just launch into this potpourri. The question okay. There was a question, what is acceptable tissue preparation? And contrary to what was suggested, I wasn't trying to get out of the responsibility of answering that. We've stated in the test guidelines, and it's also said elsewhere in publication, that what I think should be the minimum is the equivalent quality of Bowens and paraffin. Okay? And nested within that is the desire for PAS staining, because that's how you get a look at the acrosomes. So it isn't, formalin and paraffin really is not acceptable, but it's not trying to restrict people to any particular regime as long as they have a tissue quality equivalent to the Bowens paraffin or better. Obviously, for my purposes, I'd much rather see glycol methacrylate. But I think we really have to state the low end, and then if we get better, wonderful. Question?
How many studies for a particular compound would you expect that to be done for? Certainly not every study. Would it be just for a 90-day study, or?
Which? For the staging, for instance?
Where formalin would not be acceptable.
In my opinion, formalin and paraffin is never acceptable for testicular tissue. Formalin and glycol methacrylate works. For the testis, let's back up a second. I don't routinely evaluate carcinogenicity studies, but I have a mixed reaction to that question. I think if one is going to put weight on effects, on testicular effects from a long-term study, and here we're talking about a lifetime study, then the same standards ought to apply. At the same time, I think you all know that there's an increasing degree of artifact and aging degeneration in those testes, so that I'm reluctant to put a lot of weight on the spermatogenic effects. Obviously, we're interested in testicular cancer effects, and there again, I think the quality of the fixation embedding is needed, and is something I'll address as I get into the Leydig cell hyperplasia issue. Really, guess what I'm coming around to is I think it ought to be done uniformly with the higher quality fixation and embedding. Lonnie, do you want to comment on that?
No, I think that I have looked at people as they've upgraded from just formalin H&E to Boone's H&E PAS, and that's enough for routine studies. If you find anything in a carcinogenicity study that related to the testis, you still have to report it. And by doing a lower fixation protocol, then you're essentially burying your head in the sand, I think. So there are a number of people, and I think Siva Geigy, you've experimented with this buoyance recently, and you've come up. You may want to make a comment, Helen, about your experience since we visited Siva Geigy and what you found. I don't know if you want to give away trade secrets or what. But,
there's no trade secrets. Basically, we just fix the testes in buoyance and glutaraldehyde, which is our normal routine procedure. And when we had the expert come in, we showed them both sets of slides and asked them to comment on quality, and the end result was they're very comfortable. Because our lab doesn't like to deal with buoyance due to the butyric acid. So if the quality is similar, it's quite comparable, then we didn't have to use buoyance. So that's what we have done, and we didn't use PAS.
Another thing that I'd like to touch on is the idea of with either decreasing dose level or decreasing duration of exposure, the window that Lonnie was talking about gets narrower. I think you can picture that easily for decreasing duration. But as dose level goes down, generally, in many cases, the number of spermatogenic cell types that's affected also narrows, so that it gets harder and harder to find the effect, or more challenging. And we then get into the question of how to quantify that. And I'll deal with that more later, but flow cytometry was mentioned. And I think as you get further and further back in the spermatogenic process, life gets harder in general because there are fewer cells there to be affected, and the amount of work, whether it's flow cytometry, whether it's histology or flow cytometry, becomes more and more difficult to pick up the effect. Flow cytometry has its sensitivity limits, and as you get into the fore-end cells or the spermatogonia, you've got less and less chance of picking something up, particularly the spermatogonia. CASA measures. This is the last of those that I'll comment on. Lonnie was correct that there are a considerable number of different measures of motility that can be derived using the CASA machines. We really don't know what the relevance of all of those is at this point. Some, like average path velocity, are probably quite relevant. But some of the other measures we're not certain on. I mentioned that we have a large human male sperm number fertility study in the data analysis phase that is designed to look at that issue for human males. And hopefully within the next year or so, we'll have some answers on which parameters seem to be the most pertinent to prediction of fertility effects. I hate the just tell us what to do syndrome. And I want to beg all of you to not get trapped up in it. I think that is a counterproductive way to operate and really want to encourage the interaction of you folks with people at regulatory agencies. Now, I know that each of you has at least one horror story resulting from such interactions, and I'm not going to apologize for it. It's a fact of life that there are limitations in ability to have people who are really well trained in each subject that comes up on both the regulatory agency and the industry sides, to say nothing about in the private sector, which is maybe the biggest source of trouble that we all have. So anyway, I want to encourage the kind of interaction that says, here are our test results. Now can we come in and talk about them? What can we do to make it better? What can I explain? I at least am very open to that kind of dialogue. And I think people in regulatory agencies ought to be. Okay, let's go to slides. Some of this material was covered by Dr. Russell, so when we hit those points, I will slide on by and minimize that component. This is the slide I used for introducing the subject of risk assessment. And I don't think anything more needs to be said about it. And the first half of this presentation is use of testis histopathology in risk assessment. To get into it, though, I need to talk about the risk assessment guidelines and some of their contents, particularly as they relate to or affect the histopathology. These guidelines are specific for use within EPA, but we have found, and I think we'll continue to find, that they have an impact beyond EPA with FDA and with regulatory agencies in other countries, particularly the EC. So a lot of what's contained in them, in principle, applies in other areas. Their purposes, ostensibly at least, are within the agency to provide guidance to program office people, and I am in the Office of Research and Development, not in one of the program offices, and to promote consistency across the agency in how they'll look at data on reproductive toxicity. And of course, others can't help but be informed of what's in them. This is how we're defining reproductive toxicity for the purposes of risk assessment. The occurrence of adverse effects on the reproductive systems that may result from exposure to environmental agents. The toxicity may be expressed as alterations to the male or female or male reproductive organs, the related endocrine system, or pregnancy outcomes. Toxicity may include, but not be limited to, adverse effects on onset of puberty, gamete production and transport, reproductive cycle normality, sexual behavior, fertility, gestation, parturition, lactation, pregnancy outcomes, or premature reproductive senescence. Now you'll see a number of factors in there, and obviously this is very broad, that aren't necessarily measured directly. Okay? But one way or another, for most of them, and reproductive senescence or premature senescence is not normally looked at. One way or another, we have a measure that includes those facets. Just very quickly, these guidelines cover what we now call hazard characterization. You're probably familiar with the 1983 cancer, or NAS, risk assessment paradigm, where they have a hazard identification and so forth. We, especially for non-cancer health effects, feel that it is not appropriate to separate the dose-response information from the endpoint results, so that hazard identification without consideration of dose is not particularly meaningful or fruitful. So that paradigm has been modified somewhat to combine the hazard identification and dose-response considerations together, and then subsequently deal with quantitative RFD calculation. So in them, the paradigm is discussed, the default assumptions and testing protocols, endpoints, sections on human studies, pharmacokinetics and SAR, evaluation of the dose response, and then characterization of the database. Then proceed to the quantitative dose response evaluation, which is determination of the no observed adverse effect level, or in some cases where there's very limited data, a lowest observed adverse effect level, or increasingly determination of an LED 5 or 10 using benchmark dose modeling technology. This is the direction in which risk assessments are headed, provided the data are sufficient to model the dose response. And then calculation of the RFD, RFC, reference dose or reference concentration, which is using either the NOAL or the LED divided by uncertainty factors to get the RFD, RFC. A critical component is evaluation of the exposure situation, and I'm not going to go into that in any real detail today, followed by the risk characterization, which is putting all of the preceding stuff together. I've just covered this verbally, what the RFD is. Now, for the reproductive system endpoints, we've divided them into 3 categories. It just turns out to be a useful way to divide things up, recognizing that many of the reproductive outcomes are influenced by both sexes in the couple. So those are called couple-mediated, and then the ones that are specific to females and males are treated separately. And there's really a discussion endpoint by endpoint or category by category of these and how they should be looked at. And when I mean looked at, I mean looked at the provided or available data, not looked at as in testing particularly. But the two are not separable completely. These are the couple-mediated endpoints that are highlighted. I think they're familiar to all of you, and I'm not going to go through them one by one. If somebody wants me to slow down, holler, but I'm presuming you just want an overview of this. On the female-specific endpoints, again, some of them are familiar, but there are two new ones. And I was struck by the comment that you have a meeting this fall on ovarian toxicology. And I'm going to use this opportunity to point out, obviously both of these relate to ovarian toxicology, but particularly the oocyte toxicity. In humans, I think you're well aware that when the follicle population is gone, you have menopause at whatever age that happens. So that if the primordial follicle population is attacked by exposures, then the possibility in humans exists for premature menopause. We traditionally really have not, unless the ovaries were really blown out, had a method or endpoints to detect that depletion. So the endpoint has been put in to the new multi-gen testing guidelines to do the histology quantitatively on the ovaries to actually count the primordial follicle population. The male-specific is familiar, I'm sure. There are requirements now in the new testing guidelines for evaluations of sperm count, sperm morphology, and sperm motility. And basically what I'm saying is we've taken this opportunity in revising the test guidelines and in writing the reproductive risk assessment guidelines to take what I call a fresh look at things and to some extent do things in new and hopefully better ways. By the way, that foal is an Arabian, and she is now pure white and pregnant. Testing protocols in the test guidelines. These are the kinds of protocols from which it's possible to get data. Familiar ones, although I don't know if there's any use of the RACB protocol within the FDA domain. Does anybody use that protocol here? Or take data from it? One? Okay.
The answer is yes, we use it extensively, but as you said, not for FDA-directed regulatory submissions.
Okay. In my judgment, as it's been modified by the National Toxicology Program, that's a pretty good protocol, and I at least am willing to accept a well-conducted RACB study as a substitute for multi-gen study. In most circumstances, at least, and in some circumstances, this could be better. Working from the bottom, obviously, a fair amount of information can be gotten from a subchronic toxicity study, especially from the histopathology, and it's quite possible to tack on sperm evaluations that will get at the effects from treated adults. I want to zero in now on some of these shorter-term studies, three that are fairly prominent. The SID study that's used for some environmental chemicals. The NTP has a short-term study, and I think most of you are probably familiar with the ICH short-term studies. All of these are roughly 4-week exposure, 28-day to 42-day, if I remember correctly, of adult animals to a compound, followed by necropsy. No breeding, no exposure of the young. And that's the next point. I want to warn you about the slide that's to come. On the surface, it has some shock to it, but it has a reason. These are genetic males. They're full sibs with a phenotype that's indistinguishable from women, from females. The issue that this illustrates is the developmental effects that are possible. And I'm emphasizing this because this is my problem, particularly with the short-term protocols. They are not designed and will not get at developmentally induced effects on reproduction because there are no exposures of the young. Here's why. This is the early reproductive tract during development. It's undifferentiated. With genetic males, under the influence of androgen that is produced, the reproductive tract differentiates into the male. If there is no androgen, it will differentiate into the female reproductive tract. The syndrome in the preceding slide was called complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, and it illustrates the extreme end of what can happen if there is a failure of the influence of androgen on the reproductive tract differentiation process. There can be a whole gradation. Now, I'm not aware of the complete insensitivity or the complete syndrome from exposures to anything, but theoretically it's possible. Much more likely one will have much more subtle effects or a pseudohermaphrodite situation in the offspring that is definitely an adverse reproductive effect, but it can be so subtle that there's a need for a fairly high quality look at spermatogenesis to detect it. So it's the whole spectrum that we're talking about. This effect, the previous one was development of the internal reproductive organs. The external genitalia are likewise affected. This happens later in the development process. So we're talking about beyond organogenesis now, and probably a bit postnatally, that one can, with exposures then, can still induce adverse effects. One of the things this means is that developmental toxicity testing that's just done during organogenesis would also only incompletely show something up, and that presumes that the offspring were looked at in this regard. Most of the time that wouldn't be picked up, and effects on spermatogenesis, for instance, which won't be obvious until after puberty, are certainly not going to be picked up. So to me, it's a real problem with the trend toward short-term exposure testing. I'm going to skip by this in the interest of time. This is just the receptor issue that I think you're probably all familiar with at this point. Now, moving back to testis evaluation. What should our objectives be? No surprise, to detect and quantify toxic effects on spermatogenesis. In addition, identify toxic effects on Sertoli cells or Leydig cells. And I think all of this is ultimately aimed at picking up potential for effects on apical functions, fertility, mating behavior, and so forth. Those tend to be less sensitive endpoints, so that we need to go back and get these measures in addition to ultimate apical function. One of the things that Dr. Russell touched on was the sperm evaluation. As he said, we can get estimates of sperm number, sperm production, by counting the cauda epididymal sperm number from counting spermatids, homogenization of spermatids. And I favor the cauda sample if that's possible, because the coefficient of variation is lower and the endpoint tends to be more sensitive. And in fact, as I was telling Lonnie last night, Bob Chapin at NTP tells me that they have never had the TID count emerge as the critical effect, the effect occurring at the lowest dose level in any of their FACB or RACB studies. We also are interested in the sperm morphology and sperm motility, things that you're unlikely to be able to get at with the testis histopathology. Possibly, if it's a nasty effect, you can see sperm head nucleus changes that will be indicative of morphology problems, but it's unlikely you get any information of utility for motility. People are given a choice whether to use subjective motility examinations or CASA. The feeling being that it's not appropriate at this point to require CASA measurements. If they're doing subjective motility, and now I'm talking about the new multi-gen testing guidelines, then what they're looking for is percent progressively motile sperm. There's a hooker to that, and that is that if they do the subjective motility, then there's no ability to store the samples. Therefore, it's necessary to do all the dose levels at necropsy. If they, well, let me back up. If they do not record the samples, then it's necessary to do all the dose levels at necropsy. If they record the motilities and come back, then they can come back and do them later, either subjectively or with CASA. And in that case, the initial requirement is to do the high dose level and controls. And then if there are effects observed, either in the motilities or in some other aspect of the evaluation that indicates a problem, only then would they have to come back and do the intermediate dose levels. Okay, the testis evaluation. And here I want to talk about subchronic versus subchronic or longer versus short term. With a subchronic duration, this is generally 10 weeks or so, there is opportunity for, in most cases, for an effect on spermatogenesis to work its way through the process, with an intermittent, well, the exposure is long enough for that effect to be expressed in the cauda epididymis. So under those circumstances, we can quantify counting cauda epididymal sperm. And this reduces the pressure on the histopathology significantly. Now, there are some things that the cauda sperm number may not show up. I think it's been adequately demonstrated that staging still ought to be done for multiple reasons. One, it is probably somewhat more sensitive, and it can give you quite a lot of other information about the effects of the chemical that are very useful. Now, for our purposes, I question innately whether we have the right to require much beyond that. In other words, require information on mechanism. However, as we hopefully move more into more sophisticated approaches to risk assessment, we'll take more and more into account mechanism of effect, the pharmacokinetics, the whole plethora of things that we all talk about in modeling. And so I think this kind of information ultimately, to say nothing about the ethics of knowing what your chemical can do, that this will become more and more important in application. There are some things that you're unlikely to pick up with a cauda sperm, the possibility of inflammation. An example that I'll give, again, it comes from Dr. Hess's lab, is that he has found, I think, a couple of chemicals now which induce sloughing in the efferent, sloughing of cell lining the efferent ducts, which can cause a plug. So that one can, at least with relatively short-term exposure, find that the testis is actually accumulating fluid. Weight can go up a little bit, and I think you can visualize how that could affect the histopathology just from increased fluid. That kind of thing is only going to be picked up from the histopathology. And obviously it remains important to look for testicular tumors. Now, short-term exposures are another matter. As I said before, in this situation, it becomes much more complex. To me, first of all, you have to consider the objectives of the assessment and the dose levels involved. What is it, and I think this relates to pharmaceuticals a lot, what is it that you're after? Okay? And the ability of the approach that you pick to detect an effect. Now, I want to focus biologically is really important. There's a tendency everywhere, I think, to be fixed on statistical significance. And obviously, it's important. But statistical significance without biological significance, to me, is meaningless. It's a lot easier to say than to take both into account adequately, particularly in the face of quite limited information. But we make real emphasis on biological significance. I've already talked about the developmental exposure issue. And finally, the relation of the observation to apical function. Did I just... It'll go toward focus? Okay. I shouldn't have messed with it in the first place, huh? I have... One of the biggest problems for me is the decision of what's adverse. Is it when you're doing a histopathology, you can find anything from complete blowout to one or two cells that are degenerating. And how do you decide at what point that becomes adverse? In the absence of quite a bit more information, a risk assessor really is left with little option but to take the conservative view that if it's there in excess of controls, it's something that has to be worried about. I would like in the future to see us carry things, and this requires research, considerably beyond that step to being able to project from, let's say, what proportion of the, let's say, primary spermatocytes is actually appearing to be affected, carrying that through to ultimately the effect on sperm production and fertility. We're trying to work in that direction. I've put down reversibility. Again, this is so dependent on the projected exposure scenario for the people who will be exposed to it. For environmental chemical risk assessment at the current time, there is really no provision made for reversibility or for dealing with it. The assumption is made in the RFD process that there will be lifetime exposure to the chemical. If that's the case, reversibility is a moot point. However, for a lot of drugs, and realistically for a lot of exposures to environmental chemicals, it's not lifetime exposure. It's relatively short-term or transient. So the effort is underway now, and this is a project that I'll be paying quite a bit of attention to over the next 2 or 3 years, is how to take that into account and how to deal with the short-term exposure risk assessment and the reversibility issue. I don't have any clear answers for you at this point. I think for pharmaceuticals, reversibility, to me, becomes a much more viable thing to consider, if for no other reason than that this is a drug to treat something else that's bad. So that the reversibility ought to weigh into the biological cost-benefit analysis. And finally, there's the monetary cost. I tried to say earlier that to me, the overall cost of doing the testing is important. And while we certainly need certain specific kinds of information to do an adequate job with risk assessment, there also is an obligation to me to figure out how to do that in as cost-efficient a way as possible. Now, in terms of the testis histopathology for short-term exposures, I've gotten these factors listed out. First of all, and critically, it's not at all likely that the effects induced by the agent will be expressed fully in the cauda epididymal sperm population or even in the spermatid population. But I emphasize the cauda population because we can also then do the motility and sperm morphology there. Okay. This is dependent on, and these things all need to be taken into account. First of all, the duration of exposure. What cell type or types is hit, and how long has that exposure occurred? This will determine both the position and the width of the window of effect. The metabolism and the pharmacokinetics. Well, let me say cell type I included already in that statement. Metabolism and pharmacokinetics. This is suppose you have extensive long-term bioaccumulation. For a short-term exposure, you may never hit the peak concentration. Now, if that accurately reflects the situation that would occur with humans, maybe that's not a bad deal. I think seldom do we have that much confidence in our ability to predict the whole scenario that's possible. But one needs to know how long it takes. First of all, what the toxic chemical is. Is it the chemical itself or drug? Is it a metabolite? And then what's the behavior of that chemical or metabolite at the target? It really, at the very least, circulating supply, circulating levels, but preferably at the target, because that's where it's acting. Finally, the dose duration behavior of effect. I think it's likely that this behavior can, for different chemicals, run the whole gamut from being dependent on the peak level attained to being dependent on the total cumulative dose over the duration of the dosing period. If you don't have that information also, then it's very difficult to predict with accuracy the behavior of that window. What to look for, what you'll find, when to look for it. So the bottom line of that is that one must rely heavily on high-quality testis histopathology in that situation. This in a different form is similar to the nomogram that was put up this morning, which, by the way, Lonnie, I believe that was first published by Dr. Etlin, wasn't it? Again, making the point that it takes a considerable period of time for effects to appear in the cauda or in ejaculates, the longest time obviously being effects on spermatogonia. If you think about the short-term studies, they fall in this category or this time frame, so that you're unlikely to pick up in the cauda anything beyond effects on TIDs. And even TID might be compromised. This is an issue of sensitivity. Lonnie showed this morning, and not surprisingly, it comes from his book. The further back you go in the spermatogenic process, I said earlier, the harder it is to pick up an effect because there are fewer cells. But importantly, the greater the magnitude of the effect on spermatogenesis. So the catch-22 is harder to find it, but if it's there, each cell that's affected has a magnified effect. If you're talking about an A, what are those, A1s or A2s? Let's say an A1 spermatogonia, 2, 4, 6, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128 potentially affected daughter cells. So compare that to an effect on round spermatids, where there's no further amplification. You have the potential for a 128-fold difference in impact. Okay, I put this in. I forget actually why I put this in. Obviously, it's to point out that there are these spermatocytes and around spermatid that are being done in, but for the life of me now, I can't figure out what I was after with that point. So I had to match you, Lonnie, with forgetting one. Dr. Russell went through this morning, and I'm going to skip over it now. The effect of a series of questions that are very useful to ask. Now, I want to stop at this point and talk about quantification of spermatogenesis. I think the point's been established as well as we can, as well as I can and Dr. Russell can, that at some point you hit a need for quantification of spermatogenesis via testis histopathology. And to get away from the slides for now, I'd like to bring the lights up and ask Dr. Russell to give me a hand in interacting with you to decide what are the possibilities You willing, Lonnie? Prime the pump effort, but it is not complete. And I'm interested in hearing from you all what you think is not necessarily practical, but the most practical that we can come up with that should satisfy the need. Would you like to lead it?
Want me to go?
Yeah, all right. It's your choice.
Okay. So let's look at the practicability of the items on this list. To some extent, what I mentioned earlier this morning is that the computers that you enter your information into as histopathologists generally don't have these types of things on them. They will have atrophy, arrest, multinucleate cells, and a few other things, or tumors or something of this nature. There needs to be a whole new classification system. But item number one, presence of degenerating slough or infiltrating cells. Useful? Not useful. Well, part of what we have to ask is, would you be able to see these on routine tissue preparation protocols? Presence of degenerating cells is also in normal animals. Very difficult to see in standard H&E, and actually in some Boone's, a lot of Boone's preparations either. Sloughing is easy to see, but is it a handling effect or is it a real effect? And infiltrating cells into the tubules. Okay. Is that something many of you see as infiltrated macrophages infiltrating into tubules? It occasionally happens. I've seen it in about 3 different conditions, all of which had some immune type of situation. If I injected, well, this is a little offbeat, but my research area now is getting rat sperm to grow in a mouse. We can put spermatogonia from a mouse or a rat into a mouse and get rat sperm produced. That's a very new and exciting and interesting area with implications many of you haven't thought about. But
vice versa.
But occasionally you get macrophage going in there because of the antigenic responses. But usually there are not many macrophages going in. So the presence, item 1 up there, the presence of degenerating slough or infiltrating cells is something you're not used to doing. But in terms of degenerating cells, when you do a good fixation protocol and the right staining, the all or none concept applies, I think, that it is a very easy way to determine when you have a block to spermatogenesis, the presence of degenerating cells. Absence of a tubular lumen. What does that mean? That's real easy to see. You can see that with about any fixation protocol that you have. I showed you this morning a Sertoli cell only tubule that had no tubular lumen. But I also showed you one right after that that did. What's the functional significance of that? What produces a tubular lumen? Actually, the secretion of Sertoli cells. That occurs in a developing animal, about a rat, about day 15 to 19. And it's an indication of at least some functioning of the Sertoli cell. But that's extremely, it's useful to know whether the tubule has a lumen or not. Any of you have any ideas on these? Just pop up with your ideas. Absence of elongated spermatids. Okay, we looked this morning at the absence of the spermatocyte layer, but would sure be a lot easier to see if elongated spermatids are gone for most of you, because you're used to looking at heads, tails, seeing them in the lumen, seeing elongated spermatids. Relatively easy thing to determine. Would it be quantifiable? Very difficult to quantify how many are gone or present. Would it show up on a spermatid count, homogenization resistant spermatid count? would probably show up if it were severe enough. Height of the germinal epithelium. For most pathologists in the group, that's something you automatically look at when you're scanning the testis. This is one of the things your eyes are trained to look at already, is the height of the epithelium. But again, this morning we saw a missing layer of cells that would have eventually led to no spermatogenesis because they were an earlier type, a spermatocyte layer. And the height of the epithelium was just marginally affected in that situation. Tubular diameter measurements. That's something a lot of people do as a measurement. That's something I didn't mention this morning, probably should have mentioned. Usually this correlates with testis weight, tubular diameters. One can measure, let's say, 100 tubules very quickly, round tubules, their diameter, and come up with some quantitative information. Some of you may have done this in the past. Generally, that's very well correlated to the number of cells that are present within the tubule. For those of you who have done that, you know you come up with a pretty good coefficient of variation. And the reason you come up with a coefficient of variation that is high is because not all tubules at all stages are the same diameter. For example, stage 8 is a little bit bigger than stage 5. So there's a natural variability. If you're selecting arbitrarily, you're going to come up with variation. But measuring tubular diameters, it's the power of the test, and so it's not very good. You're going to need a good 20 animals to detect a 10% difference in tubular diameter. 10% difference in tubular diameter is a lot of missing germ cells. Evaluation of each stage for damage or lack of a component of cell type or staging. Indicated this morning that it's probably not necessary to evaluate each stage present because one follows another and the later ones are the consequence of the former. If you had one or two stages that you looked at to look at effects, then you're in much better shape than if you just try to evaluate them all. You will find yourself in a nightmare of a problem. Looking at one or two stages is certainly adequate. Number of spermatid per tubular cross-section. Ever try to count the number of spermatid nuclei? Even round spermatid nuclei in a testis. You get around 300, you're 20 minutes down the line, you've got one tubule counted, and you spend an awful lot of time. And you've got to do another 20 tubules, and there you are. It's a nightmare. Very difficult thing to do. Number of germ cells per Sertoli cell nucleus. One way that it's a quick quantification system is that if you have some defect, or you can relate them to a constant, the constant being the Sertoli cell. Very rarely are Sertoli cells lost. So let's say you have some degenerating germ cells in a tubule, or some failed release spermatids. You could use the Sertoli cell as a constant and have a ratio of the abnormal to the Sertoli cells in the same tubule around. And sometimes these are very quick quantitative means. Yes, sir?
Wouldn't the number of Sertoli cells be constant in a cross-section? So rather than count Sertoli cells, could you not say this cross-section, I'm going to assume that the Sertoli cells are all there, and not have to go about counting Sertoli cells?
One wrong assumption, that the tubule hasn't shrunk lengthwise.
The shrinkage was due to the loss of the germinal.
No, well, you can have the length of the tubule shrink as well and increase the concentration of Sertoli cells. So that's the only problem with doing that. Yes, sir? You have another giant quick killer question.
I'll work on it. Lonnie, you mentioned 10% change a couple of times. How many control tubules do I have to examine to establish my plus or minus limits for changes within that 10%?
Depends on what you're counting.
Okay.
And we've seen in testis weights, tubular diameters, that sort of thing. You know, you're not, it's not very good. People traditionally count 50 to 100 tubules in those kinds of situations. But if I'm counting failed sperm release, I think I can get by with 5 tubules.
Okay, that's my endpoint, but I don't know that when I start the study. So how do I study that? What's my guideline for establishing my latitude in my control population?
I think you have to establish your control establish what your controls are in every experiment. And you can't rely on historical controls, if that was your question.
No. How many do I have to do? How many do I have to count for each study?
Such that the standard error is less than 10% of the mean in the long run. That's the technical answer. It's like, once you know your final result, then you can establish what you should have done to begin with. You see what I'm saying?
The practical answer.
But there is a way to calculate that ahead of time. But you
only from
you
controls.
Can't do 5 tubules and look at your standard error. And if it's around 10% of the mean, you're in pretty good shape.
I would suggest that a project that we collectively need to embark on is gathering the necessary information from lots of people's data to do that kind of power calculation work for type of effect by type of effect, and get it published. A lot of it's there if we pool resources to get it out, dig it out.
What you may be thinking I'm saying is that when you start your histopathology, you go in with quantitation in your mind. I never do it that way myself. I do more like what you do to begin with. I scan it, I look for signs of problems, I look at some key spots. If I get anything that pokes me during that evaluation, then I go back and I devise a test that will either show that it's elevated, prove to myself it's elevated effect or not an elevated effect. So I don't start these things at the beginning. I do my look, my qualitative evaluation, then if I need to, I come back and do a quantitative evaluation.
I'm afraid that time is slipping, and I can't take this as far as I would like to. I think this points out that we have a need for certain kinds of data. We don't, at the current time, have cost-effective ways to get those data. It's a difficult situation when you're trying to do adequate risk assessments for short-term, with short-term exposure data. I mentioned flow cytometry. It has its limits. The other thing, and again, it's an R&D need, is somehow get to the point of being able to do automated accounting with image analysis. And with that, I'll leave that topic. I think it's and this is one of my favorite slides that I have to impose on people, favorite pictures that I've ever taken. What are we going to be? We're going to be leaders or drag along following in whatever area of toxicology we're talking about. That's our daughter with her donkey as she was about to turn 4 years old, and now she's 15 and a half and riding a 17-hand thoroughbred. The rest of the time I'm going to take on Leydig cell hyperplasia. I think this is a topic that is a problem for everyone for reasons that I'll expand on in a minute. To deal with this issue, mechanisms and relevance of Leydig cell hyperplasia and tumors to humans, a workshop was held in late October, early November, which was sponsored by a consortium of private and or industry and government. American Industrial Health Council both put in a substantial amount of money and coordinated the putting on of the workshop. EPA put in money, quite a bit of money, and as did NIEHS. There was a steering committee put together by George Daston, who is the chair of the AIHC reproduction subcommittee, and myself were the co-chairs of the meeting. Additional members of the steering committee were Bob Chapin from NIEHS, John Cook from DuPont, and Paul Foster, who at that point was in transition from working at Zeneca to his new position at CIIT, the Chemical Industry Institute of Toxicology. Most importantly was this group of participants which was selected to provide a range of expertise in the various areas to contribute. And I think if you look down the list, you'll see a lot of impressive names that cover a wide area, from the basic biology through the pathology and through the risk assessment. And I was most pleased with the performance of that work group. I felt that it just worked superbly over a 2.5-day period. The objectives of the workshop were, first of all, were to evaluate the current status of knowledge on the control of Leydig cell proliferation, really 5 topics: control of proliferation, mechanisms of toxicity, pathology to a limited extent, the epidemiology, and the risk assessment implications. Now, I suspect all of you have slides as good or better as this. This is just to illustrate the problem here with nodular hyperplasia, and of course the tumor formation that can occur. There are some issues relative to how these are evaluated, and I think that the reason will become clear, or I'll expand on later, that it's important to know, have some definition of where the transition is from hyperplasia to adenoma. I just very quickly would like to know, we've had identified to us that either greater than 1 tubule diameter or greater than 3 seminiferous tubule diameters as the criteria for saying it's undergoing the transition from hyperplasia to adenoma. How many use greater than 1? Does anybody do this? Yes? How many use greater than 1? How many use greater than 3? Does anybody have another criterion? Okay.
3 normal tubules or 3 abnormal?
That's a critical point in my judgment. Does anybody do it with human tissue? I'm sorry that's the case, because I was hoping to learn something from that. The thing we had probably the most trouble with in this workshop was lack of human pathologists who worked with the human tissue, and lack of epidemiologists who were familiar or did anything with Leydig cell hyperplasia or tumors. Especially the latter, couldn't find any. Okay, Lonnie raised an important point, is that those measurements are arbitrary, and they're so dependent on what the tubules look like. But it was the general feeling of the work group that it wasn't really that big a deal, that if something was of sufficient severity to be important, then then that arbitrary distinction was not likely to be the limiting factor. It was felt that rarely does the adenoma proceed on to carcinoma. Although there are some data in humans that it can. And back to the point of slide quality, I mean, this is about as bad as it can get, but what use is talking about 1 or 3 micron tubule diameter criteria when you've got junk like this that you're working with for starters. I'm going to just fly through a series of slides to give you a feel for the magnitude of the incidence of this effect. Now, this does not take into account the dose level at which it occurred. It's just these are chemicals grouped several ways, chemicals or drugs, that do produce at least Leydig cell hyperplasia, at least at the high dose. First of all, there are a number of genotoxic agents, some of which are listed here. One key deduction from looking at all the data was that it was very unlikely that only Leydig cell hyperplasia would show up with a genotoxic agent, that there would be other tumors showing up that would probably form the basis for the risk assessment. Some more genotoxic agents arrayed in a different way, and I don't want to represent these as complete lists by any means. I'm going to switch away from genotoxic agents, which are probably less problematic in a risk assessment sense, to agents that are non-genotoxic, and that's where the bulk of the agents causing Leydig cell hyperplasia fall. And in many, if not most, if not all, let's just say most cases, and maybe all, that's the only hyperplastic or carcinogenic effect being produced. What's going on? And what should we be looking at? First of all, it's a key point that LH, luteinizing hormone, is the primary mitogenic and trophic hormone in normal Leydig cell function. Okay? Prolonged administration of LH to rats causes Leydig cell tumors. Okay? A generalization was made, and by the way, the conclusions of this workshop are consensus conclusions, that tumors, Leydig cell tumors, should be considered responsive to LH unless shown otherwise. That has implications in the modeling, the risk assessment approach. It was unknown what the role of paracrine factors might be, but there was a suspicion that they're important in at least a modulating sense. Now, in the Fisher rat, prolactin increases with age and is permissive of the LH response, of an LH response. Well, what are we looking at? Is that in focus sufficiently? Okay. Yes? Okay. You've all been exposed to diagrams of this sort periodically, and I just want to make the point that there's the control of gonadotrophin down to the anterior pituitary, of gonadotrophin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, from which the gonadotrophins, FSH and LH, in this case we're interested in LH, are released, go to the testis, and then the feedback control mechanism of the sex steroids. And here we're concerned particularly about not only testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, but also estrogen. The work group identified from the existing data, and these were solicited from all AIHC members, as well as the open literature, that 7 different mechanisms could be identified that were the basis for the hyperplasia or tumors. First, a testosterone biosynthesis inhibitor. Obviously, if testosterone levels are lowered, there is a reduced feedback inhibition on gonadotropin production, which obviously can lead to an increase in LH, and away we go. 5-alpha reductase inhibitor. What does 5-alpha reductase do? That's the enzyme that catalyzes the transformation of testosterone to dihydrotestosterone, and that causes the effect. It's not clear to me why inhibiting DHT levels would cause it if it means that testosterone is elevated, but it does. Androgen receptor antagonist. This is similar to the androgen insensitivity syndrome that I talked about before. In this case, the androgen receptors cannot recognize the androgen, the testosterone or dihydrotestosterone, at the feedback level. Therefore, gonadotropin and LH production is elevated. Aromatase inhibitor. This is the enzyme catalyzing the conversion of testosterone to estradiol. It turns out that estradiol, especially in mice as well as humans and primates, also is involved in males in the feedback control of gonadotropin release, and so estrogen also can have that effect. And I think you can, by analogy, see where a estrogen receptor agonist would be effective. Now the last 2 are a bit different story. I hope I can get this straight. I'm going to go to dopamine first. Elevated dopamine or dopamine agonist levels interfere in rats with prolactin levels, prolactin production. And in rats, prolactin, let's see, reduced prolactin levels downregulates LH receptor levels on the Leydig cells. As a result, then, the Leydig cells are not as responsive to LH, testosterone levels are lower, feedback inhibition is reduced, and LH is elevated. Lonnie, is that right? Okay. The key point there is that in humans, the Leydig cell LH receptors are not affected by prolactin level. As a result, dopamine agonists are considered, that mechanism is considered not to be relevant, was considered by the work group not to be relevant to humans. And GnH agonist is another one where rat Leydig cells have GnRH receptors, and activation of those receptors also increases androgen production. Humans do not. So once again, that mechanism is considered not to be relevant to humans. Bottom line, there are 5 mechanisms that are considered to be either relevant to humans or we don't have enough information to rule them out. There are 2, though, that are not considered to be relevant to humans. So the mechanism by which a compound is inducing the tumors can become very important. I'm listing now some of the ones that fall within the different categories, and just for your perusal, I'll just give you long enough to look down these lists. These are the testosterone some of the known testosterone biosynthesis inhibitors. Notice a lot of them are drugs. Oh, let me back up a step and point out vinclozolin, which is a pesticide that is a testosterone biosynthesis inhibitor. It's also an androgen receptor antagonist. So it is not essential that any one of them, that a chemical only act by one mechanism. Androgen receptor antagonist. Prosimidone is a relative of vinclozolin. And 5-alpha reductase inhibitors. Finasteride is the best known example. Here's a good example of some strange things that happen when you use computer-generated slide making. That was an alpha when it left my computer. At least I thought it was. GnRH agonists and dopamine agonists. So these would be ones that have mechanisms that are thought to be not relevant to humans. Now there's a bunch that fall and can be categorized in other ways for which we don't know a whole lot about their mechanism and therefore are not categorizing them as such. But it's an impressive list, and there are some pretty important chemicals on here. Perchloroethylene is a predominant chemical in dry cleaning. A number of the fluorochemicals, the so-called HCFCs, something we're categorizing as nitroaromatics, and others. MTBE is the gasoline additive that's stirred things up recently. Okay, what about it all then, and what about the human incidence? This is a muddy situation at best. If you think about it, how many men have their testes examined histopathologically at any age? Add to that the likelihood that at least in the test species, the hyperplasia tends to be one that arises with long-term exposure, and only the particularly bad actors show the effect relatively early in the exposure regime. So again, there's not a whole lot of necropsy or autopsy of where they take a detailed look at elderly men's testes. So with that as a background, only palpable tumors are going to be recognized, and then maybe only if it's caused a recognizable physiologic problem. The incidence of that is 0.4 per million and is concentrated among white men. In one study, limited, where they did ultrasound on the testes of known oligospermic men, they found a 1% incidence of detectable masses. And the information we have is that most of those were Leydig cell masses. Of the known tumors in humans, it's estimated that there's about a 10 to 15% malignancy rate. So it can metastasize and go to malignancy. Known risk factors among human populations are the following: congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Somebody asked about stress before in another context. I think the adrenal keeps raising its head with respect to the reproductive system, and is another area that I think really warrants some fairly intense attention. Klinefelter syndrome, existence of cryptorchidism. Here again, this is probably a developmentally induced effect, and in many cases where there's testicular atrophy. We know that gonadotropin levels increase substantially when you have atrophy. It's interesting that among to this point, for flutamide or finasteride, which both are very efficient at causing hyperplasia and adenoma in test species, there's no increase been observed in humans. Now, I ask you to recognize that our power for detecting effects in humans is in general, pretty weak. So, I mean, it's information in the positive direction in terms of positive, in terms of I don't think any of us wants these things to be a problem for humans. I certainly don't. So what conclusions can be drawn from it? First of all, the work group felt that the true tumor incidence is not known, but is likely to be low in the general population. That doesn't rule out pockets that, having particular treatments or exposures. The incidence of hyperplasia is unknown simply because there's no look made for it. There's a need for some study of unselected populations, and I would say also exposed groups, using ultrasonography or a careful autopsy of unselected populations to try to get a better feel for just what the incidence is. Now, how does that then related to risk assessment? And again, these are the work group consensus recommendations or conclusions. First of all, and most importantly, that every case, every situation needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. There are too many variables to try to cookbook it. You have to, in the absence of data that are stronger, make the assumption that at least with the mechanisms that were identified, it may be relevant to humans. Okay? Hyperplasia only, in other words, when hyperplasia is the only thing that's seen, it may be discounted, okay, under certain conditions. First of all, that the long time to appearance. If the hyperplasia appears early in a long-term study, then one has to start worrying about it and look further. But if there's a long time to appearance of the tumor, then it may be discounted. Certainly, if the mechanism has been declared not relevant, it can be discounted. And again, if it's the only thing that has shown up, there are no other effects that could be interpreted as related. So that's the hyperplasia. Adenoma is concerned unless the mechanism has been declared irrelevant. We've already covered the modes of induction earlier. The GnRH agonist, the dopamine agonist have been declared by the work group to be not relevant. These cannot be ruled out. There's that mess again. Now, the presence of hyperplasia or tumor, regardless of the relevance or concern that's allocated to the hyperplasia itself, does indicate that it would be prudent to look for other effects. So the recommendation is made that one look carefully for other reproductive effects. So now we're talking about non-cancer health effects. In terms of the extrapolation, the quantitative risk assessment, it raises some interesting questions about how those data are going to be handled. The new cancer risk assessment guidelines from EPA are now in the Federal Register in proposed form about 2 weeks ago. They open the door for using what we're calling nonlinear extrapolation for some cancers or some tumors. And again, case-by-case judgment should be exercised, but the default that's being recommended for non-genotoxic tumors is the nonlinear approach. In practical terms, this means the no-AL uncertainty factor approach, which usually will result in a higher regulation level than the dose level than the linear extrapolation that's traditionally been applied to carcinogens. The default for genotoxic ones would continue to be linear, but remember I said that seldom, if ever, does the adenoma appear, the Leydig cell adenoma appear in the absence of other tumors that really would be perhaps of more concern. And finally, that the margin of exposure, when that's being calculated, is done for pesticides, that the slope of the dose-response curve needs to be very much taken into account. Let's see, what do we have? That's it. I have a little after 1:45. I think I've used up my time plus about 5. So I'm going to stop there.